One city, two sides. The conflict that arose from the division of Berlin and the construction of the Berlin Wall.
The construction of the Berlin Wall was the biggest conflict that arose from the four-sector division of Berlin. The consequences that followed were negative. The German economy was split by the wall, the world powers were locked in a game of political chess, each one struggling for control of the population. Following the reunification, citizens struggled to reconnect due to the development of diverse cultures. Long-term, the wall impacted the social, artistic, and philosophical communities of Berlin.
World War II concluded in Europe on May 7, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. Germany was in debt from the war, and multiple governments were fighting over Berlin. From July to August 1945, the Big Three met to discuss order in Germany at the high-stakes Potsdam Conference. The Big Three was comprised of U.S. President Harry Truman, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. During this conference, many controversial topics were discussed moving forward from the war. Truman boasted to Stalin about America's first successful atomic bomb detonation. Here, the beginnings of the Cold War period can be seen. In addition, the leaders talked about dividing and demilitarizing Germany following its Nazi occupation. The Allies compromised, agreeing that Berlin would be separated into 4 sections, each with an Allied ruler. The Northeast Soviet section, the Northwest for Great Britain, the Southwest French section, and the Southeast for America. The Western nations combined against the Soviets in 1947 to encourage the USSR to give up their communist control. The West formed their own currency, creating an even greater divide between the two sides. The change in currency made the West more prosperous, and many businesses moved to the West side. As more people were trying to move west, tensions started to grow between the conflicting governments. The Soviets were angered by the losses and restricted travel to keep people in the East. The heightened security along the border made it difficult for families to meet and for people to commute to their jobs.
As the conflict continued, the Soviets formed a blockade around the western borders, preventing the people of Berlin from accessing resources. The Americans and the British combated this by airlifting supplies to the west, and now they are famously remembered for being the heroes of the people of Berlin and the underdogs in this conflict. The U.S. Air Force was commissioned for Operation Vittles, while Operation Plainfare was led by the British Royal Air Force. These airlifts lasted from 1948 until 1949.
It was a case of more planes, more food, more raw materials, shipped without pause from 8 different airfields in the Western Zone.
As the airlifts continued to succeed, the Soviets ended the blockade. Without relinquishing control of their territory, the Soviets compromised. They ceased pressuring the Western territories and allowed them to access supplies. Tensions continued to rise. Over the next decade, the amount of desperate refugees fleeing the east climbed higher and higher. On July 20th, 1961, the New York Times published an article stating that the flow of refugees had been well over 1,000 a day since the prior week. On the night of August 12, 1961, the Soviets had had enough. Khrushchev decided to construct a 27-mile-long wall dividing the East and the West, mostly made of barbed wire fence and eventually brick and mortar. The East Berliners were devastated, waking up to a blockade and no connection to family, jobs, or freedom.
The wall stood 11 feet tall and eventually extended over 96 miles to surround all of West Berlin. Heavily guarded with trenches, barbed wire, guard dogs, and armed guards, the wall was meant to prevent escape. However, the people of Berlin were determined. They tried to climb over, dig under, and hide in vehicles crossing the border. Some accounts say another 5,000 people escaped over the 28 years that the wall stood. Sadly, nearly 200 people died attempting to cross the wall. While the struggle was happening in Berlin, the Cold War was waging on. On June 12th, while visiting West Berlin, Ronald Reagan famously addressed the Soviet president.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
When the Cold War came to a close, officials of the East German government caved to popular demand and declared that all citizens should travel freely over the borders. After nearly 30 years of separation, the Berlin Wall came down on November 9, 1989. Ecstatic Berliners climbed the wall, surging through the gates, and in some places demolished the wall themselves. The Berlin Wall was the most prominent result of the conflict between the 4 governments. After many years of struggling for power, the Soviets finally compromised with the Western powers and allowed travel across the wall. The Iron Curtain had finally fallen. Spawning from this conflict came a plethora of long and short-term problems.
Economic short term. When the sides reunited, many East Germans thrived off the West Germans' prosperity. Unemployment levels went down while wages continued to rise. A New Yorker article explains how shortly after the destruction of the wall, unemployment rates decreased and wages increased in East Berlin. By eliminating the conflict, the two sides were able to grow economically. Political short term. There was political debate in governments around the world about what to do with the wall when it came down. Some governments from other countries bought sections of the wall to display and preserve, while domestically, it took a long time for German officials to endorse the preservation of the wall. Remaining portions of the wall can be seen sporadically throughout the city, and most have been graffitied due to the lack of protection. Social and cultural short term. At first, many Germans disliked having parts of the wall left up. For so long, they'd been kept apart, and having any memory of something so destructive made people resent the remains. Because the East had been paired with communism for so long, when the sides reunified, the West wanted to get rid of everything the East had and make all of Berlin like the democratic West. However, this insulted many East Berliners because the associations with communism led to judgment and distrust of their population. Doing away with all of their culture became an issue during this time, and it created social stigmas that separated the people even more, despite just having been brought together again. Hope Harrison states in her article that the two sides compromised, writing, "Commemorating the wall's victims and preserving its few authentic remains in Berlin is important for history's sake." Social and cultural long term. After some years, the German population became more accepting of having parts of the wall stay up. Similar to other monuments or artifacts that remain from terrible historic events, such as the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, it is important to have solemn recognition of past mistakes. In addition, when the two sides of Berlin reunited, Germany was dealing with a major identity crisis, and as a result, both sides clung to their centers of culture and pumped them with economic support. The East and West sides of Berlin struggled to work together to form an economy that could support the numerous cultural institutions, such as theaters and art museums, that had popped up since the wall went up.
The division of Berlin into four sectors was a major conflict following World War II that involved governments, economics, and the people of Germany. While the sectors were meant to solve political debates after the war, the decision created another monumental issue, the formation of the Berlin Wall, dividing the city into the democratic West and the communist East. America, Great Britain, and France were locked in a stalemate within the Soviet Union for 28 years, both sides holding onto their land, hoping a resolution would come before more war broke out. The people of Berlin faced hardship during this time, separated by force and struggling to continue life normally.
Despite the wall coming down and reunifying a nation, the impacts it had on the people and the world were largely negative. Even though some point out how the wall did diffuse political tensions by instigating a stalemate, the consequences created stereotypes and suspicions around the former East Berliners. Moreover, there has been a lot of debate regarding whether the wall should stay up or not, and the ultimate conclusion has been to leave the remains as a bitter reminder of the consequences that conflict brings. The final compromise came with the tearing down of the wall, which not only united a country, but represented how damaging division can be.
Thanks for watching!
Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev. Tear down this wall. This wall. This wall. This wall. This wall. Open this gate. Open this gate. Every man is a German, separated from his fellow men. German, German. Tear down this wall.